Hi all. I'm Yasmeen Khayr. I'm the research coordinator here at Curl. I'm also a Loyola alum, and I didn't graduate not that long ago with my bachelor's and master's in sociology here. And yeah, I'm excited to present a bit. Brooker, do you want to start the slides for me? Okay, can everyone see that? So again, I'm going to be presenting on work that I did for my master's thesis here at Loyola. So I'm going to be focusing on gender and sexuality beliefs among Muslim men on college campuses, more concretely kind of looking at the intersection of masculinity, religion, religiosity, and sexual assault beliefs and how those are formed. So go ahead for the next slide. So I just want to start with giving some context to this research and to kind of give us a foundation before digging into the specifics of the study. So research on sexual assault has primarily focused on women and survivors of violence, and less so on men and perpetrators, despite the fact that, men are statistically more likely to perpetrate sexual violence and gender-based violence. So in a way, men are, underrepresented in the literature and the research, and Muslim men even less so due to heightened stigma around sex, sexuality, and sexual violence within Muslim communities. So I really want to kind of hone in on why Muslim men and what about them is intriguing to us. So Muslim men occupy an interesting intersection of identities that really place them as both part of a dominant gender identity as well as a religious minority within the United States. So what this means is that, like, while they may face marginalization and discrimination due to their Muslim identity, and for some it might intersect also with racial and ethnic identity and marginalization due to those identities as well, they also benefit from their gender identity as men in a male-dominated society. So often, in order for them to kind of move ahead in a way, kind of taking up power, they also have a tendency to elevate their sense of male dominance through heteronormative gender roles. And so this will be important as we kind of dig into how they understand and conceptualize sexual assault. And then we also have to look more broadly at what is happening across Muslim communities in the United States and the intense stigmatization of sex, sexuality, and sexual violence. And because, of the stigma attached to sexual assault, it's often something that can be used to assert dominance, especially over women. And it is likely that it's not going to be addressed because of the stigma around it. So it's likely to be denied or ignored and not taken, with care and to kind of address those harms. And so I also want to, I also just want to kind of put a note on the gendered Islamophobia portion. So any research done with marginalized groups such as Muslims, you have to really be cautious of how they're being framed, both in the research process and in the findings that you end up reporting on. So, and doing it so in a way that does not reify any further harmful stereotypes. So I want to note that the study really tries not to reify Islamophobic notions that Muslim men are inherently violent and that women are oppressed, but rather to locate Muslim men within a larger gendered structure that is perpetuating violence across communities and particularly within Muslim communities. So we want to rather understand the root causes to these beliefs and behaviors that are happening widely rather than isolating it to a single person or a community. Next slide. And so, with all that in mind, I came up with a few research questions that I wanted to kind of dig into. So the first one being, what attitudes do Muslim men on college campuses hold regarding sexual assault? And then more specifically, how does their religiosity and their adherence to masculine role norms impact those attitudes? Next slide. So I want to give a little background to where this study came from. It came out of research done between Curl and Heart, a national nonprofit focused on reproductive justice, sexual health education, and sexual violence prevention across Muslim communities. So Curl has had a really strong partnership with Heart for about 10 years now, and Nadia, the executive director, is with us today. And so we've, various projects have been done with them, but more recently in the last couple of years, we conducted research and evaluation focused on their sexual violence 101 workshops, which were done across a few campuses across the country. And a survey was put out after the workshop to the participants to get a sense of their acquired knowledge around sexual violence terms, general issues and resources for survivors of sexual assault on campus, and then their perceptions on a few sexual assault myths that were particular to Muslim communities. And so the graph here is kind of one of our final findings that we saw, and it was, it's showing 4 statements that were asked of participants, and there are all these, sexual assault myths that are particular to Muslim communities and broadly. And so across the board, we found that Muslim men, we found that Muslim men to have statistically significant different perceptions of sexual assault myths as compared to women. And so this really was, alarming to us, but also no way not surprising, but, alerted us to dig deeper into the intersection of gender and religion as it pertains to how Muslim men are socialized to think about power, sexuality, and sexual assault. So I will also put, just a shameless plug in the chat, all of Heart's information so you all can follow them on all the things on the social media. So yeah, that's kind of where this project kind of stemmed from. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so I kind of want to spend some time on like the theoretical foundations of what we're dealing with here. There's a lot going on in this visual, and I'll dig into each one particularly, but really wanting to look at how sexual assault attitudes are formed, the role of gender and where that plays in, and then the role of religion, and particularly Islam and Muslim communities and how they're addressing some of these things. So we'll go on to the next slide to look into sexual assault more specifically. So to really understand how these attitudes are formed, we really have to understand how it's deeply rooted through rape myths, which are generalized cultural beliefs concerning victims that perpetuate aggressive behaviors and victim blaming to undermine the gravity of sexual assault. So many studies have studied rape myths and the factors that influence these beliefs, starting with Burt's study in 1980, which found that sex role stereotyping, adversarial sexual beliefs, and acceptance of interpersonal violence were really, really associated with rape myths and how they were understood. But then more recently in the 2000s, there were other studies that focused also on sexual aggression and traditional gender roles and their impacts on rape myths. So by understanding some of these roots, we can start to delve into how religion and gender and other factors like these, and particularly masculinity, impact the formation of these negative sexual violence beliefs. So the next slide, please. And then while there has been, less research regarding the role of religions, for Muslims impacted by sexual assault, we really have to look at how our faith communities are being taught about sexual health, sexual assault. And so while Islam as a faith tradition frames sex and sexuality as forms of worship and service to God, patriarchal interpretations of sex has been dominated by men and has historically institutionalized sex as impure and as an act that must be suppressed. And we've seen this in different, day-to-day experiences within Muslim communities. And so more research currently has focused on dismantling the stigma around sexuality and sexual health within Muslim communities. And they're done by Muslims with Muslims, but the findings still reveal that like young Muslims still operate through a sexual framework based on purism, sexism, and patriarchal norms. And so these patriarchal interpretations then operate as religious justifications for shame, and they reinforce a gender hierarchy in which men are morally regulating the purity and sexuality, particularly of women, as a form of power and control. Next slide, please. And so then we have to place sexual assault beliefs in the role of faith-based approaches to sex and sexual violence within a larger context of kind of hegemonic masculinity. And I've used this as kind of my framework for a lot of this work. But hegemonic masculinity is an interactional and systemic form of masculinity in which it perpetuates and naturalizes a gender hierarchy within a social structure and through social action. And so that means that everyone is kind of reinforcing these ideas, whether you're benefiting from them or being disadvantaged by them. But because, you know, we're taking this as a norm, it's really hard to break it up and being able to disrupt it. And so this often fosters sexual aggression and hostility towards women. And so these, you know, those patriarchal interpretations are one example in which Muslim men can perpetuate their dominance over women and use it as a form of power. But it's less clear how those masculine role norms are impacted by the cultural practices of religion, and then how that then impacts their perceptions and behaviors around sexual violence. And so gender role stress is another idea that has been helpful to kind of understand this a bit more, but it's an idea that men are more likely to perpetuate aggression towards women. And studies have tried to kind of assess the role of religion in how those, in gender role stress, how that works. So one study found that like a high level of religiousness is associated with lower levels of gender role stress. So in our minds, we can say, okay, so if a Muslim man is religious, then he's not gonna, he won't have any aggression towards women, he won't be inclined to assault a woman or something like that. But we know that that's still happening. So it's really, you know, how are these studies really helping us understand the cultural particularities of Muslim men and how they're navigating their intersecting identities in a way to understand, like, why is sexual assault still happening in our communities? So can you go to the next slide, please? And so get back to this larger visual to kind of show where all this kind of intersects, but this looks very linear, but it's really not. Kind of as I've kind of said, there's a lot of overlap with where the patriarchal power and control is happening and how it can be manifested through religious justifications and cultural norms, as well as through the gender identity. So there's a lot that's intersecting here. And so that's kind of our foundation for where we're starting from. And now I'll go into a little bit more on the methods and the designs of the actual study. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so through the theoretical framework I just shared and kind of the relative exploratory nature of this research, I ended up using quantitative methods through an online survey to kind of understand the breadth and of information surrounding Muslim men and their beliefs around sexual assault, masculinity, and religion. So I acquired 47 participants who fully completed the survey through convenience and non-probability sampling from various college campuses in the Chicagoland area. And the survey itself included, you know, various demographic information, but more prominently 3 questions stemming from 3 pre-tested metrics. So the rape attitudes and beliefs scale, the masculine role norms inventory revised, and the psychological measure of Islamic religiousness. I also included some questions that I adapted from a resource Hart had created, that was focused on myths surrounding sexual assault in Muslim communities. And those myths and those questions I came up with are really similar to the ones that I showed previously, that, you know, 4 of them were used in that workshop survey that Hart had conducted. And so there were a lot of those overlapping in this survey as well. And then just to kind of bring it home, all the metrics followed a response scale ranging from 1 to 5, just to keep it consistent across all the questions. And they were all ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Yeah, I will go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I won't go into every single mean that I'm showing here, but I wanted to show the various measures that were used within each set of questions. So for the sexual assault attitudes, statements were centered on blame or victim blaming, tactics used to do harm, justifications that excuse sexual assault, and the sexual assault myths particular to Muslim communities. And that first one is, I think, right here is the overall is a combined mean of all the different metrics. And again, you can see that they range from 1 to 5, so you can really see how there's a propensity for folks to disagree with these statements. But I'll get into that a little bit more. But for the masculine role norms questions, those were divided into sexuality, dominance, and aggression. And you see here, there's a little bit more variability overall. And then for religiosity, these were all pretty different. So there was religious beliefs, which were pretty straightforward. They were also measured only between 0 and 2, which is why the number is so low, but it's also 1.97 out of 2. So it was pretty homogeneous sample in terms of, the beliefs that the participants were sharing in terms of their religious faith. But then there were also questions about religious duty and global religiousness, which was included religiosity and spirituality. So I'm gonna go into each of these more in depth. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay. So with that all in mind, I want to dig into the sexual assault attitudes, particularly which are meant to answer that first research question I had, which is what attitudes do Muslim men on college campuses hold regarding sexual assault? So overall, the composite mean was 4.36 across the measures that I showed before. So it really showed the respondents had a propensity to disagree with the sexual assault attitudes. So statements regarding justification and tactics revealed a really strong tendency for respondents to disagree. Sorry, for example, the first statement, if a woman is unsure about whether she wants sex, it is okay for a man to persist until she flatly says no. So there was 65.9% of the participants strongly agreeing. But then statements around blame and the Muslim centered myths presented a bit more variability. So for example, a woman who willingly gets drunk, then is raped, has more responsibility for what happened than if she decided not to drink. So 10.6 strongly agreed and 17% slightly agreed. So there's more variability there than for example, with the statement on tactics. And then additionally, when presented with the statement, if a woman wears hijab and dresses modestly, she will be protected from sexual assault. So 51.1% of respondents strongly disagreed, 14.9% slightly disagreed, and 8.5% strongly agreed. So again, there's a lot happening in those latter two, and they're kind of when looking at other statements in the same categories, it was a similar variability. So if you can go to the next slide. So based on that variability in the statements centered on the victim blaming and the myths within Muslim communities, we can start to infer that some Muslim men may instrumentalize blame and justifications through cultural religious behaviors and fear as means to undermine the experiences of victims and constructive ways of dismantling the deeper causes of sexual assault. But then the overall disagreement with tactics and the more overt justifications for sexual assault reveal that Muslim men may recognize the harm in those behaviors that force sex upon women, but may not completely understand the covert forms of perpetuating behaviors that justify the act of sexual assault. Okay, next slide, please. And so then we kind of want to get into the second research question, which is how does their religiosity and adherence to masculine role norms impact these attitudes? So starting with, so across both the religiosity and masculinity measures, I use gamma testing to understand the relationship between those beliefs with the sexual assault attitudes. And generally, when I was looking across those various tests, there was really little association between religiosity, particularly, and the sexual assault attitudes. I included a couple examples here that are a little out of the norm. These were actually statistically significant, and they both show negative associations between the sexual assault attitudes and religiosity. So the first focused on tactics of sexual assault, crossed with a question focused on spiritual strength, whereas the second one focused on justifications for sexual assault, and that was crossed with a question on religious strength. So outside of that norm, and those are, interesting to look at, it's still interesting to see that a higher spiritual or religious faith can be associated with disagreement with the sexual assault beliefs. But again, overall, there was really not a lot going on with the religiosity measures. And the next slide, please. So on the other hand, when looking at tests between masculine role norms and sexual assault beliefs, many of these revealed strong and statistically significant relationships. So for example, the sexual assault belief, if a woman wears hijab and dresses modestly, she will be protected from sexual assault. And that was crossed with a statement of regarding masculine dominance. A man should provide the discipline in a family. That revealed a strong positive relationship, revealing that masculine role norms are much more likely to have a relationship with the sexual assault beliefs. And then for both the religiosity and masculine role norms, I tested both of those individually against sexual assault attitudes, also through correlations and ordinal logistical regressions, and they showed similar trends where religiosity didn't have a really strong association with the sexual assault attitudes, but masculinity had a pretty strong association. Can you go to the next slide? So really to drive this home, I wanted to further test the intersection of all three. So masculinity or masculine role norms, religiosity, and the sexual assault attitudes. So I conducted a ordinal logistical regression to assess whether masculinity and religiosity together are good predictors of sexual assault. So overall, together they formed a pretty statistically significant model where masculine role norms and religiosity both explained about 30% of variance of sexual assault beliefs. However, only masculinity was a statistically significant predictor in comparison to religious duty and global religiousness. So what does this all mean? All these, research points mean. So in terms of masculinity and the variability across these masculine role norms, participants were likely to adhere to traditional gender roles in the, perpetuation of sexual assault as a form of hegemonic masculinity. So we can't say to what extent Muslim men perpetuate these negative masculine norms, but we can acknowledge the deeper manifestation of masculinity in how these negative sexual assault attitudes are perceived. So the religiosity measures all exemplified that most of the respondents adhered to Islamic tenets, but were weak in really, in terms of helping us understand how their religious identity impacts those perceptions of sexual assault. So I don't want to undermine the role of religion or the cultural experiences through religion, but rather signal a need to kind of look at other facets of religious identity and the cultural experiences of religion and how those may uncover how sexual assault attitudes are formed. So overall, the study really confirms that men, regardless of religious identity, are likely to perpetuate hegemonic masculinity within their perceptions of sexual assault. So, this both contributes to the existing literature while also giving us an opportunity to kind of delve into more of those cultural norms that may perpetuate masculine dominance and sexual violence within Muslim communities. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about the limitations. So most of these limitations stem from not engaging Muslim men in prior research. So in terms of the research methods, the surveys and the scales I used, especially the ones in terms of sexual assault, were validated measures, but none were created particularly for Muslims. So it's really hard to determine whether these measures fully capture how Muslim men perceive of sexual assault. I also yielded quite a homogenous sample. Again, I would kind of mention this, but they all had pretty high religiosity, probably stemming from the fact that most of my recruitment came from Muslim student associations, which tend to have students who are more involved religiously and are a bit more connected to their religious faith. So it's harder to get a variety of Muslims in that way through the MSAs. And then at the same time, there's also it's unrepresentative in terms of comparing it to the larger Muslim American population. So especially an underrepresentation of Black Muslims, which if you look across other types of research with Muslims in America, like that is pretty consistent. And I think more researchers are trying to be more intentional about how they recruit and trying to engage all types of Muslims across race and ethnicity, especially. But I think the largest limitation is really the stigmatized topic of sexual assault and the barriers within our Muslim communities of engaging in this larger social issue. So it does reveal to us that if we're going to confront gender-based violence and sexual assault, like Muslims need to be part of that conversation, both internally, like Muslim communities need to start bringing it up internally amongst themselves, but also within the national, more mainstream movements against gender-based violence and sexual violence. Because if we're trying to tackle sexual violence more broadly, like if Muslims aren't part of that picture, it's really hard to dismantle it across the board. The points in my study really showed that it didn't matter if you're a Muslim or not. People are still, adhering to these beliefs and then behaviors ultimately of, sexual violence. So yes, the next slide, please. So in terms of some implications, really do have to elevate the presence of Muslim men within the larger conversation around sexual assault within Muslim communities. And I want to give particular thanks to the Muslim men who did, engage in the survey and, by extension, engage in a larger conversation about sexual assault. But in terms of the research, I really hope this study allows us, particularly Muslim researchers, to create more nuanced and culturally tailored measurements and tools that capture the religious and cultural identity that comes with being part of Muslim communities in the United States. And with those experiences, how we conceptualize sexual assault. But then even more practically, hoping that we can do further research, especially with folks like Hart, to really further work that's focused on culturally specific programming, education, and tools to help Muslims confront and dismantle these deeply ingrained sexual assault attitudes in our community. Next slide, please. So just to kind of another shameless plug, but Curl and Hart have been doing some more research, actually. We've been doing a larger national study, which we have about more than 700 participants at the moment in North America, so Canada and the United States. And this survey is really focusing on general experiences with their sexual health, access and barriers to finding sexual health resources or seeking sexual health resources, experiences and perceptions on sexual violence, as well as sexual dysfunction. And so this survey actually also includes some of those measures that are around the sexual assault myths particular to Muslim communities. So we can hopefully see the trends of like, okay, what is happening nationwide across gender and other demographics, but what's happening within Muslim communities and how they're understanding sexual assault. So I will put in the chat, again, Hart's information, but also the link to the survey so that Muslims on this call, and if other folks know other Muslims or want to share this, the eligibility is here on the screen, but if you identify as Muslim, if you're in the US or Canada, or ages between 18 and 45 and are fluent in English, you can take the survey. And that would be really helpful for us, and just to kind of, bring it home in terms of trying to understand what is happening nationally across different Muslim communities. And yeah, their understandings of sexual assault and other sexual health needs. And so if you can go to the next slide, I want to end with just kind of some reflections of my own on this process and the research process. So, and especially doing this research as a Muslim woman. So from the start of this process, I knew that I'd have to be really aware of how I navigated this kind of research on something that is pretty stigmatized in our Muslim communities, and how that may impact my own role within Muslim communities. And that came out of seeing how heart was being affected nationally, and how many conservative leaning folks within our communities are really taking heart as a target, and being aware that that is something that people will come at us with. So trying to be aware of that, but then also, balance of going into different Muslim communities and different Muslim spaces, and my access to those spaces because of my name, my hijab, my connections to various communities in the Chicagoland area. So, coming in and asking folks to answer questions about sexual assault was something to balance in that way, knowing how they might react, but then also knowing, that I'm also part of your community. So it's not trying to divide us in any way, but trying to really get at something that's happening. So in a way, I also had a lot of assumptions about how Muslims and men particularly would react to this research. So I often found myself over explaining, trying to really prove the importance of the research, and probably in some instances coming off really defensive, just because of personal experiences I've had and others have had when just bringing up these kind of topics in Muslim spaces. So that was kind of one aspect of that. I also wanted to bring up kind of the institutional aspect of this. So it's really difficult to do this kind of research with Muslims within an institution and a department that is still very much learning how to support and not tokenize their students of color, especially within graduate research spaces. So there was a lot of doubt projected onto some of my ideas from faculty that did not fully understand or take hold of my expertise in the community that I come from. So doubts on how many men I would be able to recruit, the types of questions I could ask. And I really, I internalized a lot of those assumptions that ultimately just become barriers personally, and then barriers to conducting this kind of research without projecting those implicit biases onto my participants, onto the Muslim men that I want to engage with. And then all on top of that, I had my own hesitations and fears that really stem from imposter syndrome, but also kind of constantly thinking about what others, especially other Muslims, would think about me and this kind of research. So, there's a lot of things that are going on there, but ultimately I had to really try and ground myself in the value and the social responsibility we have when it comes to trying to understand this kind of violence and how it shows up in our Muslim communities, and really trying to go beyond the stigma that so many of us hide behind. So just wanted to kind of share that as a kind of a ending of, how we were able to do this research, and the benefits that can come from it, and hopefully the conversations that I'm trying to kind of engage people with. So yeah, that's all I got. Next slide is just a thank you to everyone here, especially to Hart and Curl, and being able to have this opportunity to have these partnerships and do this kind of research. And so, yeah, I really want to open it up for questions and comments and thoughts, and especially with the Muslims in the room, if they're there and want to have this conversation. I'd love to go into any specificities of the work as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yasmeen, thank you so much. It's great to hear about your work. I was saying to Yasmeen before that though I have been aware as a colleague of her work, I actually had not sat down and gone through it. So this is really exciting to hear, ironically, for the first time. Apparently, the closer you are to a researcher or research, the less you know about it. I don't know. But thank you so much. This is really good. I'm going to open it up to anybody who would like to. You can use the official raise your hand, or you can just be brave and unmute yourself and ask a question. Vincent, with the raised hand.
I had to do the polite thing. That's what I'm good for. So my question for Yasmeen is regarding like demographics for this survey. First of all, great job, Yasmeen. I loved your presentation. It was but I was specifically wondering, and also sorry if my Wi-Fi cuts out. My Wi-Fi hates me. So is gender binary, and was sexuality included in the survey?
Yeah, I asked about, so we kept it particular to Muslim men. So if they identified as men, then they were able to participate. And I did ask about sexual orientation, but there wasn't a lot of variability there. So it wasn't really something to kind of pull out as much. But yeah, I did ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. And then the other demographics were just race and ethnicity, year in college, and I think that's really it. There wasn't a lot of demographics. That wasn't really them, just kind of see what people were, who was coming up, but yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate it. That was just what was swimming through my mind, because I was like, ooh, was there any significant findings in that? But
yeah, there was not. It was mostly straight men.
Hey, that happens, but at least you asked.
I did ask.
It's something. You don't know what you're gonna get unless you ask.
It's true.
So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you, Vincent. Emily Jones.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much. That was super interesting and very compelling. And I think you raised so many good points. My question is, I was just wondering about some of that like pushback that you experienced, if you're comfortable talking about, like where that came from. I'm particularly interested if, you were obviously discussing with Hart and other, people in the sexual assault advocacy community, if they were, kind of the ones giving some of that pushback, or if it was more like faculty. And like I said, if you're not comfortable talking about that, that's totally fine. I was just curious.
No, it's totally fine. No, I feel like, with Hart particularly, like Nadia, from the get-go, we were, pretty upfront about that this is going to happen, that this is possible. And just, you're in spaces enough to know, like, anytime these topics are brought up, there's going to be pushback. But yeah, it's definitely more on the side of just folks who aren't really familiar with Muslim communities particularly, and more like sexual assault. Like some of the faculty I was working with wasn't their like field in terms of like, specific to sexual assaults, and then also not really being part of the Muslim community either, doing research with Muslims. So I often had to like, I'd go in with one idea and they'd throw out another one instead. And I'm like, I feel like we can play with this a little bit more. So definitely more from faculty, and just kind of like, there's also just that, like, you're in a grad program with doing a master's, just finish your thesis and get out of here. Like, there's that kind of pressure that comes with this too, was of like, you're not even going to publish this, just get as many as you can and call it a day. Like, don't fret too much about how many people you're reaching or things like that. So there was kind of like there wasn't as much care taken to, I feel like, the recruitment part of it, which I probably could have done a bit more with, or if I had more support, I would have been able to do that a little bit more. So definitely more on the side of faculty and whatnot, who are just not familiar with this, the community, or the kind of this kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. I see Christine George has a question for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely wonderful. I mean, it is so strong and rigorous. I'm really wowed by it. So I just want to say that to you. I had two questions which are sort of related. One is, I mean, obviously because you were doing students on campus, you weren't, it doesn't reflect the larger Muslim community. And so I'm just, is there work, or have you been thinking about work, or has Hart been thinking about work that tries to get to the non-college, population, and and education could be a proxy for that. But, I'm just, I mean, I don't even understand. I mean, this is my ignorance, the distribution within the Muslim community, and the different sectors of the community in terms of how many are college bound and how many aren't, et cetera, et cetera. And one, I think it would have been interesting to perhaps and I'm not sure about this, but also have had a question about first generation, second generation in terms of immigration.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering if there's more of a traditionality, and I don't even know what that means, or different shaping of how one looks at one's beliefs in terms of that, and more of an incorporation into American standards of masculinity.
Yeah. So for your first kind of question, which I'm already forgetting, I'm sorry. Oh, yes. So the burden study, which I brought up at the end of my presentation, that is, a national study. It's not focused on college students. It's really across the board. So we're trying to get folks across race and gender, race and ethnicity lines, across gender and sexuality lines, across education lines, across income. Like, it's really trying to branch out and try and be as representative of the American Muslim community as possible. The reason I ended up doing just college students is, one, accessibility, as a non-funded graduate student, as well as, like, a lot of the research is really focused on college students and college campuses and what's happening on colleges. And even with Hart, like, a lot of where they were able to, get access tended to lean more on college campuses rather than other Muslim spaces. And Nadia, you can definitely pipe in here and expand on anything that I've been saying, but that's really kind of why we're trying to expand and kind of get a broader sense, because there's like nothing done on Muslims in this intersection with sexuality and sexual health and sexual assault. So trying to start from scratch is hard. No way. And then in terms of the first generation, this was also something that Reese had brought up afterwards, another faculty member, but I can't remember why I did not choose to include that as part of this. I think in a way, I think it would have muddied it a little bit in terms of just trying to understand where some of these intersections are coming, but also at the same time sorry if you can hear that, recognizing, and this kind of showed that, like, these gender norms really, like, are, they're not specific to one community or one people or whether they've been here for 2 years or all their life. Like, I think that is probably a smaller detail that we could probably get into and see if there are significant differences there. But I think coming from a standpoint that these gender, the patriarchy and oppression that is happening through patriarchy, like, that is across the board. So I think that's probably a reason why I didn't include that, but it's definitely something that we always are thinking about, especially with research with immigrants and people who are coming here. But also, I think not wanting to always frame us as immigrants, and even though that is something that is key to our identities, like really trying to focus in on, we are Muslims living within the United States, and a lot of us have been here for a long time, and wanting to see what's happening there. So I think that helps answers your question a little bit. Oh, you're muted, Christine. You're muted.
By the very fact of the size of what you were doing, and
Yeah.
I mean, you can only have so many variables. I was just thinking forward. I think
Yeah.
that would be interesting. The other thing I just want to say that would be interesting is the point you made about within Islam, a very positive view of sexuality, and it as a good thing, as a celebration to God. And I think that that's not true of other religions, such as mine, Christianity, necessarily. And I think it would be, I'm just saying this, it would be interesting at some point to see if the relationship of religiosity within among certain groups of Christians has the same relationship to the views about sexual assault. I don't know. I mean, this is
No,
completely
direction. I think it gets to the point that like it is more likely than not that across religions, in the faith, like the religion itself and like the theology of it, that sex and sexuality are usually not portrayed negatively, but it is how, you know, societies and in the case of STEM, I feel like, you know, goes back to colonialism as well, of like put on, you know, inputting these patriarchal interpretations on, you know, how can we control society more? Let's use sex and sexuality to really do that, and really like ignoring the fact that that's not what God's telling us. Like, and so that's a hard thing. Like, probably even having that line in my study would get some Muslims make them not happy, you know, to say that like this is not something that is bad, it's not something that's impure, something that even that purity language comes a lot from you know, colonialism and how it's been input by Christian missionaries and like all these other larger factors that have been happening for so long, for generations. So yeah, that's something I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think it's a really interesting nuance that I found really intriguing when I was doing this work.
Thank you. So we have a question from Leslie, and then Hector Garcia will ask a question, and then over to Nadia in that sort of where we're going to go.
Okay.
Leslie?
Okay, very quickly, Yasmeen. First of all, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful. As always, you educate me, and I appreciate it so much. And but as you were presenting, of course, I had a question, which I'll try to keep brief.
You're fine.
Which is, it's sort of, as not surprising, it's kind of similar to where Chris was going, which is, I realized you focused on campus population, but I wonder if any of the men that you interviewed were married, because I wonder if you asked the questions about sex and consent and those questions, as I can't recall them exactly, in the context of a marital relationship or a fully committed relationship, if you might have received slightly different answers.
Right.
That doesn't, you know, or if you had asked the unmarried population how their views around their dance in sex was, how it differed from what they might have answered in your research. I do think it might make a difference. Yeah. And I recognized you couldn't do everything, but.
And I mean, to the point, just to bring it back to the burden study that we're doing with Hart, like that is actually asking about marital status, and it's probably more likely for people to answer those questions. But yeah, again, it's a smaller detail that I wasn't able to do in this study. But there were a few like questions, both within the sexual assault questions and the ones that were particular to Muslims, that were asking like um, like is like is sexual assault within a marriage a thing, or like something like that.
Yeah.
Better language, but there were a few questions that were asking about sexual assault within marriage particularly. But I think you're right in terms of like, I mean, a lot of, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but a lot of Muslims, not, you know, single, non-married Muslims are probably not thinking about sex and sexuality in this way. But I think that's a whole nother ball game to go down.
Well, if I could just say one more quick thing, and that is that I think religion governs or molds marriage
Yes.
often.
Yes.
And so attitudes may change when taken in the context of that relationship. That's it. I'm done. I'll shut up.
No, that's totally right.
Thanks, Leslie. Hector.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you. Felicidades. So Yasmeen
Gracias.
Khayr was my student on several occasions. And I'm quite proud to see how you've just grown in so many ways. So that's the first thing. The second, my apologies for being slightly late. We have several MA defenses in Women's Studies, Gender Studies. As the new graduate program director, I want to make sure that I'm present and ask questions, but I also wanted to be in this space as well. I also want to formally invite you to speak in my class. I teach courses on masculinity studies and women's studies, gender studies,
Yes.
and I make sure to speak about, quote, global masculinities. We're not a minority or minorities in plural, according to which lens. So that's why I think your research is just fundamental. You know, we're not in the margins to ourselves. We're not invisible to ourselves.
Right.
And the diversity within masculinity studies is gigantic. And someone like Jasbir Puar, who's more of a theoretical feminist who comes in from a US lens towards the Middle East, is fascinating to me, but also looking at post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, queer theory, and figuring out that a lot of what we see as, quote, normal or natural is not in other parts of the world, which is what I'm getting at here, because some of what I do, as you know, is Mexican masculinities, which is very, very plural. And as I've mentioned to you and others probably in this space, I have family that's Palestinian, and like Palestinian Mexicans, yes. You know, so what's interesting to me is I hear you and I hear the different men, young men in my family here and in Mexico, and how religion does or doesn't affect. But one thing that I do find, which is from my standpoint very detrimental and toxic, is the frat boy culture in the United States and how that frames a lot of what it means to be a young man in the US, I'm going to say WASP dominated narrative out there, the hazing, the elephant walk. We just talked about this week. All of that was foreign to me, culturally very foreign. When I was in college in the United States, I had never seen any of that before because the alcohol wasn't hidden. So just questions like that I find fascinating. And I think your project, you know, can be unpacked further and be comparative and national and transnational. So I'm excited, and I will reach out so that we can collaborate, invite you to my courses, and further the Curl Women's Studies, Gender Studies Alliance. Muchas gracias.
Definitely. Yes, gracias. Yeah, and as you were talking about frat boys, it came to mind, like within Muslim communities and within Muslim student associations, we have this term Wallah bros, which are these, like, you know, these men who go around thinking they're like, you know, verse and everything Islam, and like as if, you know, they learn from their online sheikh like everything they know about Islam, and they're just preaching to the choir left, right, and center, and policing people left and right, particularly women. So that's kind of what's coming to my mind, of like there are these like subcultures of where this toxic masculinity can really show up, and like, you know, in an ideal world, I just really want to talk to them and be like, what is happening here? Please tell me. But you know, getting them to engage in that kind of conversation is.
I can share some videos again in Spanish. I know you're comfortable in Spanish, of Muslim Mexican men who are having, quote, issues with how liberal women are becoming in Mexico.
Yes.
And that contradicts what US pop culture does to women around the world outside of the US or certain populations in the US. So I found that fascinating, because then I started thinking myself, well, you know, in time and place, gender, sexuality, it keeps morphing and changing. We have to step back and push aside certain narratives that are quite toxic, I would say, and limited.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And we see it, I hear that kind of language all the time within Muslim spaces, like, oh, you feminist Muslims, like talking about choice and whatnot. There's no choice in Islam, or like, bad things like that, that just like, you are just so threatened by us. Like you just are spewing nonsense here. But yeah, that's definitely something that comes to mind.
Yasmeen, it seems like a good transition. Nadia, go ahead and unmute and we'll hear from you.
Hey everyone, my name is Nadia Mohajer. I'm Executive Director at HEART. First and foremost, I want to thank Yasmeen for this brilliant presentation and just your incredible courage and bravery in doing this work. I know the pushback and the challenges all too well, and I'm really grateful to be in partnership with you and with Curl and to continue this work. I just want to uplift some of the few points that were made just in the last comment in particular, there and Christine's comment as well. We have been noticing, unfortunately, a rise in what we like to call Muslim male rights activists, and those Muslim male rights activists are finding a lot of camaraderie and community in right-wing Christian sort of rhetoric and thought. And so, to Yasmeen's point about how colonialism and, Christian thought has really colored the way that Muslims in America think about gender and sexuality. In addition to that, like that socialization, and in addition to that, the need and the desire for certain Muslim groups to want to find community in right-wing right-wing Christian groups because of their stances on, for example, gay marriage and abortion rights and things like that. It is really concerning and troubling to us. We are often targeted by those right-wing Muslim male activists, and just talking about getting this research out for Yasmeen's and then our burden study. That is actually, we have a sample of 770 people right now, and we've done some initial analyses, and we're seeing that these attitudes are the same, like the gender differences are showing up still. I know somebody asked about sexuality earlier. 22% of our sample does not identify as straight, so that will be a very interesting sort of subgroup to look at. I just want to name that, like, one of the things in terms of the pushback and limitations of this work is, that there are groups that are just choosing not to take the study and not to engage in this study, either because of their own denial of the issues, or because of their perceptions of feminist work and what HEART does, or out of fear of outing their own communities with the issues that we are trying to discuss. So I think this presentation raised a lot of those important points, and I'm excited to see where this larger study goes. I really do think that it's going to offer a lot of points of reflection for both Muslim communities as well as the larger world in how we think about men and boys and women and girls and things like that. And the last point I want to bring up is Leslie, you were talking about marital status. We're definitely asking about marital status. I want to I appreciate your optimism around how marital status can change the attitudes. So I'm definitely going to be interested in seeing if there is a pattern there. And I want to name that anecdotally, we haven't seen that. And we are actually, I'm concerned when I hear young boys and young men have these attitudes. I'm concerned about what they're taking into their marriages and how it's not a switch that they can just turn off. And so that is definitely, something that we think about a lot. And when religious authority, and this is true in like other faith communities too, when religious authority is dominated by cishet men, I think that also kind of sets the agenda of how we talk about gender, sexuality, and marriage. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nadia. Any other questions? Prakruti, I saw you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, it just feels weird when the hand's up for too long. It feels like I'm being intrusive, like, hey, talk to me, talk to me. So I lowered it and was like, I'll get to it when Nadia's finished answering. And yes, I want to add my voice to the chorus. Amazing presentation. I was curious, and I think you touched upon it a little bit in your presentation, but from, and again, anecdotal experience, but just conversation about religiosity and in general, social movements within the academic sphere tend to be a little colored and polished because we're within a different demographic, and maybe there's peer pressure about so voicing certain beliefs. So just to see if you'd come across like either confirmation or contradiction between some similar conversations you may have had within the community, the faith community outside academia, and some of your research with Heart or with this. If there's, they sort of speak to each other in any way, either in debate or in agreement.
Sorry, can you rephrase a little bit? I kind of got distracted a little bit as you were.
Sorry, I know. Okay, I'll try. I'm sorry. No, I'll try to be more articulate. And just if your research within this was, I'm going to do an academic study, right? Like of people, of Muslim men on campus, but also from your experiences and anecdotes from outside campus within the larger faith-based community. If sort of these conversations speak to each other, either in contradiction or confirming certain findings and attitudes that you've seen.
Yeah. So in terms of like the academic space, I found, well, within my own like studies and like as I was going through grad school and whatnot, like anytime I'd, have to come up with a proposal or something, I always would fall back to Muslim communities and things like that. And it was never like a negative thing, but it was always like, oh, we've never seen that before. And like, I don't know how to help you because it's never been done before. So there's a lot of like, on one hand, like tokenization, like, oh, you're doing great because it's like, it's never been done before. It's new research. There's going to be limitations left, right, and center, but you're doing it, so that's cool. So there's a little bit of that that was happening, which for me didn't feel supportive enough, because it's like I still want to like do this well and want to do this to the bringing justice to our communities and not having them be colored in a way that's always comparing to other faith groups or always having to use religiosity skills that are meant for Christians and not for Muslims. And like, even within that, I found a lot of like, okay, there's still a lot that has to be kind of created from scratch. So there's that kind of dynamic that was happening when I was doing, coming up with the research in the academic space. And then, with Muslims, I don't know, it's really hard to kind of know what's happening because the community of Muslim researchers feels small often. And even doing like sociology in college, people are like, you're not going to pre-med, you're not doing medicine, like yada, yada, yada. Like there just like wasn't an interest in like trying to see what's happening socially with our communities. There's also that kind of nuance. I'm not sure if that answers your question at all, or if you have follow-ups to kind of go off from that, but that's kind of what's coming to mind at the moment.
Yeah, no, it sort of does, but in just extending that point, sorry to take up more time, but in just extending that point, give me a moment while I articulate. If anyone has a question, please go.
No worries. Take your time.
I was wondering too, I suppose this is a question for Nadia and for you, Yasmeen, both as researchers and as activists within the community. How do you balance out a desire to want to investigate and explore, which includes investigating things that are positive, are life-giving, but also inevitably, things that are toxic, that are, to say, to use a watered-down phrase, problematic about the community. At the same time, that you all doing that within your faith community versus me doing it within my faith community, given that in spite of right-wing rhetoric, white male Christians aren't actually under attack by the larger society. How do you navigate that sort of sense of like, I want to explore, I want to understand, I want to better, at the same time that you're sort of I would think a natural defensiveness is perhaps a pejorative term, but a protective sort of feeling like, how do you balance those two things out of recognizing that the Muslim community in the United States, one context, is under constant attack, and then you want to sort of hold up and say, okay, how do we have a critical analysis that isn't, just adding more to a larger narrative, a larger false narrative?
Nadia, do you want me to start or do you want to go? Yes, all of those things. I think this is also something that was brought up even when we were doing the workshop study with Curl, like trying to bring this up in a way that people aren't going to just be like, oh, like this is just going to be fuel for Islamophobes and like it's going to be used against us, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like, okay, we've that kind of like excuses in a way. I feel like a lot of that was a bit more prevalent closer to 9/11 and like closer to times when like a lot of that was really like at the forefront, where I'm like, where now it's like, y'all, we have work to do still. Like if we want to really like be the community that we keep preaching to people, like we have work within ourselves that we have to do. And there are a lot of things that are happening that, that we're not like excluded from those hard conversations just because we're Muslim, just because we've been targeted in other ways. And so, this was kind of what I was getting at in kind of my last like reflection of like, yeah, I was like, I didn't know what it would be like to do this kind of research and do something a bit more, that can be sensitive or can be stigmatized or can be used against me, that kind of language. But again, I had to just be like, okay, wait, why am I doing this? What is the point of this research? Who can it ultimately help, hopefully, in the long run? Like, what are we trying to get at? If we want to be a healthy Muslim community and like ones that is really preaching what we try to practice, like, we have to start digging into these harder conversations and stop hiding behind the guys, stop falling to victimization in terms of that kind of discrimination, and noticing that both things can be happening. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. Nadia, if you wanna, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're on right on the money. And I would say that like in all of our trainings and education materials, we always talk about how we're not talking about this as a Muslim problem. Like we have to recognize that this is a global like problem. It is cross-cultural, it is cross-faith communities, cross-race. It just manifests in very unique ways in Muslim communities, just like it manifests in very unique ways in Jewish and Christian and other cultural communities and faith communities. So, it's always just reframing it back to that and saying, we recognize that this is a community that is, under attack all the time. And that has a lot of grief and pain that comes with it. And we also recognize that if we can't tell our own stories and if we can't tell our own narrative and it will be told for us. And that's what's happening right now, right? Like under the guy, I mean, just 2 weeks ago, you saw what happened in Atlanta with Asian American women and how, anti-Asian sentiment is on the rise right now. And, that is being used, the state is using that to their advantage to say we need more law enforcement in these communities to protect them. But in reality, it's a function of the need to surveil communities of color, and law enforcement is not the option or the solution rather to this issue. And so I think, if we can't tell these stories, then policies and grants and fundings and all of that kind of stuff will continue to tell really problematic narratives. And that's what will be doing even more harm to us. And, I mean, the fact that, you can't expose this because it's going to add more fuel to Islamophobes' fire. I mean, that's actually something that a lot of men who do harm in our community are using to their advantage right now. And that's not okay. We can hold both. We can hold the complexity of being a man of color and being a Muslim man, and we can hold the truth that those folks can also be people who harm, and we have to be able to kind of address both in a way that's accountable and just.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for your, as always, your eloquence in unpacking that. Thanks. Other questions?
I think I found a way to articulate it, but if it's still not clear, please feel free to we chat about it in a different space when I'm more lucid or found the words. So what I was like you mentioned earlier that one of the pushback or the nuance was that there wasn't a lot of research being done in this space, so it was new. But I want to ask, and I wonder if these conversations about just like in general, being a Muslim man and the intersection of sexual assault and religiosity and masculinity, are they part of non-academic interactions within the community, if you had any? And if yes, do they sort of confirm or deny what you've been finding through academic research?
I mean, I think it comes from not being able to have those conversations where, like, in Muslim spaces, like, you bring up that kind of harm or like calling someone out of like, that's like really problematic that you're saying that or whatever, something like that. Like it's completely shut down. It's not even considered. Like I've had various conversations with men during my time in college where it's just like the pride and the stubbornness and like denial is so high. Like they don't even want to engage in that conversation, and it ends up being really it could be a really threatening space for the person asking the question, and it's often women or women who are calling those kind of things out or like not even being able to so it's really coming from like just the like inability to have those conversations where I feel like we hope to use research as a way to be like, can we show you now, like, this is proof that these things are happening, like that it's not, if you're not going to believe us, like, would you believe some data? Maybe they won't, maybe it won't do that either. But like, that's kind of like our approach at the moment of like, if you're not going to listen, we're trying to like get as many people to kind of bring this stuff up in a hopefully more like confidential space where we can share like, these things are happening systemically. Like we are seeing patterns, we are seeing these trends. So please wake up. Because, there's often so much pushback, like not even wanting to have any kind of conversation, let alone a critical conversation about what is happening in our communities. So yeah, a lot of it's coming from not having those spaces to engage this. So yeah.
Thanks. other comments or questions? It's been a very good conversation.
Thank you all. All the questions have been great.
All right, well then I will leave it as usual to you, Yasmeen, for any final thoughts before we call it a day.
Yeah, no, I'm just grateful that everyone who showed up, and the questions that you're asking are all like definitely things that we've been thinking about and mulling over, but it's good to kind of just share it with people outside of sometimes just me and Nadia, or Curl and Heart. So yeah, thank you so much. It's really good to share all this with you all.